Hello, everybody. Great to be with you. My name is Michael Millerman, millermanschool.com, and today we have some articles to go over. One, which I haven't read yet, called How Aleksandr Dugin Influences the West, and then another that I did have a quick read over yesterday, Peter Thiel on the diversity myth. But we'll start with Dugin. Before we get started, thank you for being here. If you're new to the channel, I do a lot of work on political theory, political philosophy, right-wing anti-liberalism, culture war, but from a more intellectual angle. And if you are not new to the channel, thanks for being here. Like, subscribe, share, comment, and all the rest of it. And let's begin. How Aleksandr Dugin Influences the West. This was published today, if I'm not mistaken, in Unheard by Aris Rusinis. As Europe's leaders anxiously await the results of Ukraine's long-anticipated counteroffensive, it is significant that Aleksandr Dugin's latest essay opens by citing Ernst Junger's influential 1932 essay, The Worker, to call for Russia's total mobilization to win the war. Though dismissed by Junger's biographer Thomas Nevinin in 1996, back when history had ended as pseudo-prophecy, because democracy has twice within this century triumphed, apparently, over its totalitarian foes, few writers in 2023 would display such certainty. That's kind of confusing. But okay, The Worker, this essay by Ernst Junger, 1932. Incidentally, you can see some commentaries by Heidegger on Junger and an exchange of letters between Heidegger and Junger. So, okay, Dugin's latest essay opens by citing that work. If anything, Junger's writings, along with those of other thinkers of Germany's interwar conservative revolution, seem to foreshadow the political ferment and geopolitical fault lines of today. As Dugin observes in his rambling and only partially comprehensible essay published last Friday, quote, if we turn to Junger's idea of total mobilization in a Heideggerian manner, then we get an existential theory of mobilization, as when death is before us and we don't run away from it and we don't turn our backs on it, that's when we exist authentically. In a sense, this can be described both as a total mobilization on an existential level and as what I would call an awakening. Let me just comment here very briefly that this idea, this reflection on existential authenticity and death, what it means not to turn your back on death, that is a topic that, That is a topic that Dugin has written about before, incidentally, in some of his other works on Heidegger. So it looks like he's drawing on it for this essay here. You may know that in Heidegger's Being and Time, for example, you have some thoughts on man's being towards death, what that means for the possibility of authenticity. I won't go into the details, but one of the points that Dugin has made, sorry, I'm getting a pop-up from my Skype. Let me just get out of there. One of the points that Dugin has made when writing about Heidegger is that maybe one of the ways in which peoples are existentially distinct is in how they face death. But as I say, we need not go into the details. Let's go on here. Just as in The Worker, Junger foresaw the fusion of man and technology in the trenches of the First World War, heralding the death of bourgeois liberal values and the birth of a new age of titans, Dugin asserts that Russia's special military operation in Ukraine is awakening Russian society, shifting it from a period of inauthenticity to one of authenticity. In Dugin's assessment, Russia's overt enemy, the Ukrainian people, barely count, now being something less than human. I would really want to read the original article to see that, because Dugin's often mischaracterized when it comes to his view of the Ukrainian people. But maybe he said something like that. Could be. Instead, in a wild perversion of Schmitt's thought, the war has revealed the very real absolute enemy of the human race, to which only theological categories are supposed to be applied, because we thought we were fighting enemies in Ukraine, but we ended up in hell. I paused the comment again. Those of you who know Dugin's writing, you know that it's saturated from time to time, depending on the kind of writing it is. I mean, sometimes, for example, let me put it this way. It's saturated with themes from theology, mythology, eschatology, apocalyptic imagery. It's a little bit of a task sometimes to understand how literally he means all of that and whether it has a more rational, intelligible counterpart if you translate it from the language of mythos to the language of logos, as he sometimes puts it. But okay, so that enemy, that hell, we continue, is us, the current postmodern globalist West, a society degenerating as humans. where transgender parades already hardly allow us to understand what kind of species we're dealing with. Ultimately, post-humanist formations, i.e. cyborgs, are to follow because Western globalist circles are the last transitional stage from human being to algae. Okay? If you're totally unfamiliar with Dugin, that gives you a sense of what he thinks about global liberalism and the globalist American empire and all of that. Okay, transgender parades, cyborgs, and the transitional state from human being to algae. That's the current postmodern globalist West. That's the hell that, according to Dugin, Russia's fighting. While Dugin's work is often carried by Russia's state propaganda channel RT, Russia Today, his influence within Putin's regime has been vastly overstated. If anything, the apocalyptic rhetoric he applies to the Ukraine war has greater currency in the West, particularly among the American populist right. Back in 2014, as noted by the Ukrainian scholar of radical right intellectual thought Anton Shikostov, now an influential Twitter personality in the war's online front, Dugin created a narrative which consisted of four major ideas. First, that Atlanticists brought Nazis to power in Ukraine, thus declaring a war on Russia. That's like, the rhetoric of the coup, 2014 and all of that. Secondly, that the interim government was a Nazi junta and had no legitimacy, and Dugin and Putin have both spoken about that, the idea of modern Ukraine as an anti-Russian project. Thirdly, that Ukraine did not exist anymore as an artificial state formation. And finally, that Russia must act decisively to prevent the Atlanticists from establishing control over the entire territory of former Ukraine. These arguments are now as wearily familiar to anyone who follows the war on English language social media as they are to Russians themselves. Okay, so keep in mind, we're reading this article, How Aleksandr Dugin Influences the West, and you see we're now transitioning into the theme, how Dugin's basic forced lines of interpretation have been taken over by some on the national populist right outside of Russia. So the arguments are now wearily familiar to anyone who follows the war on English language social media as they are to Russians themselves. When Tucker Carlson can describe, as he did last week, Zelensky not as the democratically elected leader of a nation fighting invasion, but instead as, quote, sweaty and rat-like, a comedian turned oligarch, a persecutor of Christians, a friend of BlackRock, unquote, he has adopted, consciously or not, a Dugin-like framing of Russia's aggression against some existential evil. If Dugin remains an outsider of sorts in Russia, then he has nevertheless helped to shape both the contours of the war in Ukraine itself and international perceptions of it. For a marginal outsider, Dugin certainly seems influential. In any case, as the editor of Coda Story, Natalia Antaleva, correctly observes, the argument about whether or not Putin personally reads Dugin is somewhat irrelevant, because Dugin is plenty relevant to the leaders of the Lugansk and Donetsk separatist movements who consider him a teacher. As Shikostov notes, Dugin's previously state-funded Eurasian Youth Union was prominently involved in the initial 2014 stages of the Ukraine war and, quote, strengthened the pro-Russian separatist movement in eastern Ukraine, fueled ethnic and social tensions, launched disinformation actions, and declared alternative political centers, unquote. Dugin's Eurasian Youth Union, or ESM, acolytes took up prominent positions in the new separatist republics. Alexander Priselkov, leader of the ESM cell in Russia's Southern Federal District, became Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs for the Donetsk People's Republic before his mysterious death in 2014, while ESM activist Andrei Purin became the DNR's first vice prime minister. So, in other words, the article is saying it doesn't really matter whether Dugin reads Putin because the leaders of the breakaway Eastern republics do, and they do at a high level, and they do in a serious and official manner. Other fringe political figures on the edges of Dugin's circle achieved prominence in both stages of the Ukraine war. The Russian adventurer Igor Girkin, or Strelkov, is a familiar name to Ukraine watchers, first as the DNR's Minister of Defense, and later as a military analyst and harsh critic of Putin's shambolic prosecution of the current invasion. But for Dugin, Girkin is something else entirely, the mystical embodiment of the Russian myth, a fearless Russian Orthodox warrior heading to a sacred war on his own accord, who by seizing Slavyansk like the nuncio in Fiume appeared on history's stage as the ghost of a true Russia to guide Russia into its glorious Eurasian future. I mentioned before, Dugin tends to interpret current events, military and otherwise, in this high-pitched tone of apocalypticism, messianicism, messianism, and so on. So you can see an article, for example, not only what he wrote about Gierkin in 2014, but also what he has written about the Wagner Group this year. What he's written about Prigozhin and all of that more recently also has that kind of flavor. So you can check that out if you want. Maybe later I can show you where to find it. With his opaque political philosophy, I hope you don't mind a little plug here. If you go to duginbook.com, you'll see I wrote a book on Dugin's political philosophy. I encourage you to check that out. With his opaque political philosophy merging both the esoteric traditionalism of René Guénon, whose acolytes include both our own King Charles and seemingly Ukraine's chief of intelligence, Budanov, and an interpretation of Germany's interwar conservative revolution, which tips more sharply into fascism than the original, Dugin embodies the strange ferment of ideas which attended the fall of the Soviet Union. As the scholar of traditionalism Mark Sedgwick observes of Dugin's philosophy, quote, "In the West, it has generally appealed to intellectuals whose understanding of modernity has led them to disenchantment with it and alienation from it." Yeah, I think it's fair to say, for example, I teach Dugin at millermanschool.com in the context of criticisms of modernity, of the crisis of modernity, of postmodern left-wing kind of woke ideology. So everybody's trying to understand what is the meaning of the crisis of modernity, its transition into postmodernity, and is there anything we can learn from the discarded thinkers of the 30s and 40s and of the German conservative revolution and so on that can help us through our crisis. So again, in the West, Mark Sedgwick observes, Dugin's philosophy has generally appealed to intellectuals whose understanding of modernity has led them to disenchantment with it and alienation from it, unquote. This makes them marginal figures in a broader political scene. But, quote, for those with experience of Soviet modernity, however, traditionalism could very easily seem to present an entirely accurate analysis, unquote. After all, quote, again, quoting Mark Sedgwick here, nowhere was the loss of the sacred, more dramatic than in the officially atheist Soviet Union, and nowhere else were the two substitute cults of science and progress more assiduously advanced, and nowhere else was the cult of progress more obviously illusory. Sedgwick's insight is the key to understanding the influence of radical, right-wing, anti-modernist, and conservative revolutionary thought on both sides in the Ukraine war, lost in the tiresome and intellectually sterile debate over which side contains the greater number of quote-unquote fascists. Kept isolated by communism from the development of the post-war liberalism which still maintains a faltering hold on Western political discourse, as communism discredited itself, radical intellectuals in the post-Soviet sphere turned their attention to the last great intellectual attempt to transcend liberal modernity, the conservative revolution, until recently discredited in the West by Germany's subsequent disastrous Nazi interlude. In this story, Ukraine's largely Russian-speaking second city of Kharkiv, birthplace of both Ukraine's nationalist Azov movement and hometown of Dugin's early patron, the Russian National Bolshevik provocateur Edward Limonov, plays a significant role. Even now, Kharkiv functions as the organizing base for the Azov-linked exiled Russian ultranationalists and neo-Nazis fighting Putin's invasion through their incursions into Russia's Belgorod. As the Kharkiv writer Anatoly Voronin observes, the city's status as an ethnic and cultural borderland between Russia and Ukraine forged an unusual hybrid identity and a form of nationalism quite distinct from that of Western Ukraine, where both Russian and Ukrainian radical right intellectuals interacted with each other in shaping their worldviews. As Voronin asks, how do we explain the generally good relations between Dugin and various Ukrainian right-wingers in the 2000s? No one in Azov ever denied the profound influence Dugin had on young Azov leader Andrei Belitsky. Dugin's influence, funded by Putin's government within the Ukrainian dissident political scene of the 2000s, included cooperation with the poet and right-wing activist Dmytro Korchinsky of the Orthodox fundamentalist Bratstva Party, whose militia is now fighting Russia in the east. As an aside, the author writes, a young American volunteer with them I met in Kharkiv complained his fellow fighters dragged him to Orthodox Mass early every morning. Dugin even found favor with the fascinating, complex Alexei Arestovich, until recently Zelensky's strategic advisor, but back then a Eurasianist opponent of Ukraine's relationship with NATO and the West. Complicated, right? All of these figures, all of these movements, all of these parties. On one hand, Ukrainian nationalists, on the other hand, Russian radical Eurasianists. But the author is trying to point out Dugin has had some interaction with and some influence on that whole sphere. Dugin's original ambivalent stance on Ukrainian nationalism allowed for a degree of influence, perhaps surprising now, broken only by his sudden dramatic turn towards denial of Ukraine's very existence. Nevertheless, though counterintuitive today, fringe right-wing political ideas then possessed both unusual reach and strange overlapping ambiguities. The influence of both Dugin and the conservative revolution is perhaps best embodied in the fascinating political career of the Azov movement's intellectual star, the Kharkiv native and first lady of Ukrainian nationalism, Elena Semeniaka. Described by her professors at Kiev Mohyla University as a brilliant student, reserved and introverted but committed to her work, Semeniaka's PhD thesis, The Transformation of the Conservative Revolutionary Subject in Ernst Junger's Work, From the Worker to Anarch, in Ernst Junger's Creativity, revolved around Junger's relevance to the new world she saw dawning in the 21st century. As the analyst Adrian Nonjon observes, Semeniaka rose to popularity in the Duginian traditionalist movement thanks to her article, Conservative Revolution as Mythological Modernism, published in Volume 4 of Aleksandr Dugin's anthology In Search of the Dark Logos, which unfortunately is not available in English. She was invited to speak at the International Conference Against the Postmodern World, which was organized at Lomonosov Moscow State University in 2011 by the Tradition Center chaired by Dugin. I just want to pause for 1 second here. Back when I was in graduate school, a long time ago now, and I argued that we should be studying right-wing anti-liberalism, not only to see whether there's something true, interesting, exciting, profound, and all of that in and of itself in those authors, but also because people are reading them, discussing them, studying them, implementing their ideas, interpreting them, having a battle of interpretation over their significance, whether it's Schmitt, Junger, Heidegger, Guénon, Evola, or what have you. And anybody who just limits themselves to reading the liberal and the leftist authors is going to be blind to something important that's happening in the world, not only in Russia, Ukraine, but also, I would argue, in other places. But to continue here with Semeniaka, sorry for pronunciations, and the influence of Dugin on her thought and all of that, let's continue. While she now dismisses her relationship with Dugin as merely a one-off meeting, her early work, such as 2011's transformation of Ernst Junger's alternative to the bourgeois individual, approvingly cites Dugin's definitions of conservatism, just as her geopolitical worldview, like Dugin's, derives from the British political theorist Alfred Mackinder's concept of the world island, far more influential in Russian Eurasianist thought than it ever was in its homeland. Dugin's shadow looms over, and I should just say, those of you who don't know, Dugin writes a lot about geopolitics, including the book Last War of the World Island, Geopolitics of Contemporary Russia. So here you have a reference to the notion of world island, Mackinder's concept. Dugin's shadow looms over Semeniaka's writing and speeches, which can often be read as a conscious rejection of her former mentor, following the two widely divergent paths each took as a result of Ukraine's Maidan revolution. Just as Ukrainian and Russian commentators battle to convince international observers that the other side are the real fascists, Dugin and Semeniaka compete to convince the European and American radical right that the other side are the real liberals. Yet each, despite their two respective nationalist projects being locked in an existential war against each other, share many of the same reference points in the conservative revolution, particularly their use of Junger's The Worker as a lodestone. We're going to continue in a minute. I just want to remind you, Junger's Worker came up at the start of the article, in case you're just tuning in, where the author of this piece was reminding us that Dugin's latest essay opens by citing Junger's 1932 essay, The Worker. And so now he's able to show how this other figure, also influenced by Junger, but now finding herself on the other side of the divide between Russian Eurasianism and Ukrainian nationalism, it shows you the commonality in the intellectual sources to some extent. So that's how we are talking about Junger in this context. So back down here. Often dismissed as a Nazi, Semeniaka more accurately occupies a far more interesting intellectual space as a conservative revolutionary whose concept of a pan-European political sphere distinct from an Asiatic Russia and a liberal American-led West, derives directly from Junger's political thought. As she writes, the point of Ernst Junger, who offered one of the earliest and most insightful descriptions of the coming totalitarian orders in his interwar classic treatise The Worker, is that the difference between the two regimes which rivaled for the planetary domination in the 20th century and the post-war neoliberal order is in fact not so striking. For Semeniaka, the value of Junger in understanding the present is unparalleled. Quote, it is his creativity that is considered the brightest example of the alternative of the Enlightenment project of modernization and is widely known for its futuristic and even forecasting value. In other words, it can be used to make predictions. As she wrote in her intellectual autobiography published on the American white nationalist website Countercurrents, the Azov movement offers a means to translate her academic interests into real-world politics. Quote, I could say that what I studied in theory I developed in practice. This is the third way, the conservative revolution, but revived for today. All of these theorists were also advocates of pan-Europeanism, and that is what our projects are all about, unquote. As she remarks in an explicit rejection of Dugin's work, quote, our goal is clear. It is the creation of the sovereign, military, and political pan-European bloc, confederation, which continues the classic tradition of the European third geopolitical way. That's why Prof. Dugin is wrong, she continues, by pretending by means of his fourth political theory that the third geopolitical way is no longer possible, and that all attempts to restore the European superpower, geopolitical subjectivity, and the leading positions in the unipolar world are anti-Russian encroachments in the service of American imperialism, unquote. For Semeniaka, as for Dugin, as she observes in her essay on black metal, the goal of the conservative revolution is, quote, to cancel not only the era of Enlightenment, but also that of Renaissance and Reformation. In other words, it aims at building the new Middle Ages. And I'll just add here, some of you may know that phrase, the new Middle Ages, from writings of Dugin's, where he takes it from Berdyaev's The End of Our Time. Okay, I'm going to continue in a moment. Let me just remind you what we're doing. At the moment, we're reading How Aleksandr Dugin Influences the West, an article at Unheard. And I'll give credit to the author once again as we go through and scroll back up. I just don't want to lose my place right now. Thank you for being here. I appreciate it. From time to time, we do these article readings on right-wing anti-nationalism, right-wing anti-liberalism, various forms of nationalism, debates within conservatism about the status of postmodern, post-liberalism, all of this kind of theory, ideology, and philosophy. So like, subscribe, share. I appreciate everybody being here. Give a few minute buffer at the beginning and let people trickle in. That's a great idea. From the Can Opener podcast, I know sometimes I just schedule this on the spot and launch right into it. Yes, Dugin does definitely have a comedic edge. People who have written about him, for example, Charles Clover in the book Black Wind, White Snow, has also said something about what it's like to spend time with Dugin. And I think everybody eventually picks up on his comic and ironic skills. But anyway, that's not our main focus. Our main focus is to see how Aleksandr Dugin influenced the West, this article at Unheard. So we're going to continue with that now. Mocking Girkin's marginality, Semeniaka instead posits Azov's national core as the engine of history, the vanguard, quoting, of the Ukrainian nationalism of the new generation, which offers the alternative both to the West and Putin's Russian Federation, unquote. In Semeniaka's assessment, quote, according to Junger's forecast, the Titans will reign throughout the entire 21st century, but then the gods will return, casting the Titans in the Tartarus again, but also completing the eventual decline of the anthropocentric history which began with World War I, unquote. It is in this process that the Azov movement can play its historical role, she believes. Quote, that's why on a global scale, as pompous and surreal as it may sound, we will feel a relief only when we hasten the coming of a new meta-historical eon. You know what's funny as I read this? By the way, I should say I don't know anything about this person. I've never read her works or seen her, read her essays or seen her mentioned at this length. But the idea of anthropocentric history that we're in at the moment, as well as the idea of meta-historical outlook, attitude, or orientation, you may remember that from recent streams on Leo Strauss, incidentally, where he characterized the modernity as being primarily anthropocentric, and where he called for a kind of transformation of historicism into something that's oriented towards the meta-historical, or in other words, towards the eternal, towards the true. But okay, fine, back to the article. When I interviewed Semeniaka back in 2019, the author writes, she had just published her own translated selection of Junger's writing to be distributed among soldiers at the front. At the time, I thought her prediction of a coming great war against Russia, 2019, in which the West would be embroiled and in which Ukraine would forge a deeper cultural and defense relationship with Poland and the Baltic states as part of her Inter-Marium project, was a wild and unlikely fantasy. But the Azov movement, though still politically marginal, has been significantly boosted by Russia's invasion in numbers, military power, and in its reputation as dogged defenders of the Ukrainian homeland, as during the siege of Mariupol's Azovstal. Azov offshoots such as Ukraine's 3rd Assault Brigade and Kharkiv's Kraken Regiment play prominent roles in the war and can reasonably hope to trade it for political capital however the war ends. Whatever the strange ambiguities of their earlier relationship, Dugin and Ukraine's nationalist intellectuals, like Semeniaka, are now bitter opponents, locked in an existential conflict against each other, in a sort of esoteric, rightist shadow war, distinct from but embedded within the far greater Ukraine tragedy. When the Russian state accused Azov of assassinating Dugin's daughter, Daria Dugina, a still unproven claim, it only highlighted the strange intertwining of Russian and Ukrainian radical right-wing politics. On the one hand, these are wildly obscure intellectual currents on the fringes of right-wing thought. On the other, Western liberals cheering on the Russian Volunteer Corps' raid on Belgorod, like American Republicans regurgitating Dugin's portrayal of Zelensky as an incarnation of evil, have each found their own political personas influenced by them, demonstrating the strange ability of fringe politics to shape the wider world. While Dugin's apocalyptic worldview is now worryingly indistinguishable from that of the Russian state as a whole, Semeniaka's, while fascinating, remains marginal in Ukraine. Yet each embodies the unexpected resurgence of esoteric rightist ideas from the early 20th century in a hyper-modern war that looks set to define the contours of modern Europe. Far from obscure 20th century marginalia, Germany's interwar conservative revolution looks more relevant than ever. Sometimes history is written on the fringes. Okay, a strong end to this article. And I agree. I think for many of you, it wasn't an unexplained resurgence. You've known and you've argued and you've tried to convince people that esoteric rightist ideas from the early 20th century would have something to do with the contours of modern Europe, would have something to do with the shape of the coming world. Well, those teachers and scholars and gatekeepers who don't allow you to study esoteric rightist ideas from the early 20th century, they tried to make sure that people could not foresee what was going on or understand what might happen. Too bad for them, because you did it anyways and I did it anyways, and there you go. So this was how Aleksandr Dugin influences the West. The rhetoric of Putin's philosopher king reaches beyond Ukraine. Published today, if I'm not mistaken, June 12th, that's today, in Unheard at unheard.com. So what did you think about that article? What did you think about the claims? Did you find it interesting? Did you learn something new from it? I hope so. Make sure to give credit where it's due to the press and to the author. It was just my opportunity to read it together here with you and to add something in the commentary in passing. So I hope that you did enjoy that. And again, I think besides, there are some claims here that I would say stick out. First of all, the importance of Junger on both sides of the equation is important. The Heideggerian interpretation of Junger, after all, Heidegger and Junger had a correspondence and there's something there to pursue on the Dugin side of the equation. So, if I were, let's say, writing or researching this question further, I would be interested to see how Dugin's Heideggerian interpretation of Junger differs from the interpretation of Junger by, what was her name? Semeniaka. Sorry for, again, butchering any pronunciations. But yeah, how do they disagree in their interpretation of Junger? And how does that disagreement lead to their geopolitical divergence? That would be interesting, I think. But really the standout for me is right here. Let me just read it one more time. While Dugin's apocalyptic worldview is now worryingly indistinguishable from that of the Russian state as a whole, Semeniaka's, while fascinating, remains marginal in Ukraine. Yet, each embodies the unexpected resurgence of esoteric rightist ideas from the early 20th century in a hypermodern war that looks set to define the contours of modern Europe. Far from obscure 20th century marginalia, Germany's interwar conservative revolution looks more relevant than ever. Sometimes history is written on the fringes. You know, it's books like this. Hang on, let me pull it from the shelf. Junger, Heidegger, Schmidt, Arthur Mueller-Vandenbroek. There's a kind of imperative now, isn't there, to go back to the sources of that German conservative revolutionary thought, to really give it its due, no longer just to interpret it in light of post-war overzealous ideological liberalism, and thereby hopefully to understand ourselves in the world a little bit better. Anyway, that was that, how Aleksandr Dugin influenced the West. I enjoyed that. Now, I did have planned for us another article, one that I shared with my mailing list just yesterday. So do go to millermanschool.com, like, share, subscribe to this channel, stick around, comment in the chat, comment on the video. I did send this out yesterday, the diversity myth, but I figured today we could go over it here. Peter Thiel, writing in the New Criterion on multiculturalism as misdirection. So we're going to get to that in just a second. I want to pop over to the chat. Once again, say hello to everybody. Do I think that Islamic scholars like Rumi, Ibn Arabi, Ibn Khaldun, Iqbal have influenced Dugin's thought? I can tell you this, the closest connection that I can attest to with some confidence is that Ibn Arabi has influenced Dugin's thought through the scholarship of Henri Corbin, the first person to translate, as I learned from Dugin, fragments of Heidegger into French, and who is also a scholar of Islamic mysticism. Henri Corbin wrote about Ibn Arabi, for example, Creative Imagination in the Philosophy of Ibn Arabi or something like that, a book along those lines. And so I know for sure that that's one influence. And also Dugin has written about Suhrawardi and that kind of illuminationist Islamic mysticism. So that's another factor, which maybe also he learned from Henri Corbin. I'm not sure. Those are a couple of sources to look at. I don't know about Rumi. I don't know that Dugin has written about these other figures, but for sure about Ibn Arabi. Poland and Ukraine have no vision which is clearly distinct from that of the West. Therefore, they do not deserve to survive. Okay, maybe having a distinct vision is a criterion of survival. Maybe not. We have to see. Think that through a little bit more. And the other comments we looked at before. So let's go over to the article. The Diversity Myth by Peter Thiel on multiculturalism as misdirection. The following is an edited version of remarks delivered at the New Criterion's Gala, April 27th, honoring Peter Thiel with the 10th Edmund Burke Award for service to culture and society. This is by Peter Thiel. I was involved, he writes, in a good many campus and culture wars for almost a decade in the late 80s and early 90s when I was at Stanford. I started a conservative student newspaper, the Stanford Review, back in 1987. 4 years is an eternity in a college context, but we managed to keep the paper going for all that and more. It's still intact, 35 years old or so at this point. Of course, there was ample craziness and silliness and stupidity and wickedness on the college campus for us to report on, in 1987. Some of that craziness, however, had a much greater and more cosmic resonance. One of the very big debates at Stanford in the late 80s was about the Western culture course. This was a sort of foundational program, a year-long course all Stanford freshmen were required to take. Jesse Jackson led a protest at Stanford with the famous chant, "Hey, hey, ho, ho, Western culture's got to go." This was a commentary on the course and the particular book studied, but then also on the entire civilization covered by the course, somehow a very local and a very universal thing at the same time. I thought I might start, Thiel continues, with a reading from the book that David O. Sachs and I wrote a few years after this, The Diversity Myth, 1995. The first chapter talks about the abandonment of the great books at Stanford and describes one of the titles chosen to replace them in the wake of the protests. It's a play by Aimé Césaire called A Tempest, a retelling of Shakespeare's The Tempest in which Caliban becomes a kind of revolutionary hero. The magician Prospero is portrayed as an evil imperialist. The book culminates in a tirade by Caliban, and I'd like to read a few lines because I think it captures the temper of those times, which seem at once like a long, long time ago and not even yesterday. Quote, "And I know that one day my bare fist, just that, will be enough to crush your world. The old world is falling apart. And by the way, you have a chance to get it over with. You can F off." So that's what they were replacing Shakespeare with. So the conceit that my friend David and I had in the diversity myth, and we ran with it for 250 pages, was that all that's needed is to describe what's going on in the ivory tower, that to reveal the dangers will be enough to diffuse them. Our readers could ask for themselves, well, how does this compare with Shakespeare? Is this a step up? Is this a great book? Is this really multicultural? Is it really about non-Western cultures? Or is it just sort of a tendentious left-wing anti-Western crusade? You could present these kinds of arguments, the idea went, and that would somehow be enough to win the debate. You just speak the truth to power and it will unravel the whole mess. And of course, a lot of the diversity myth just documents incredibly silly stuff. An argument to make an Aztec newspaper from the year 1524, the shift in curriculum requirements to include courses like Issues in Self-Defense for Women and the American Drinking and Drug Culture, the latter culminating in a capstone class party where students were encouraged, of course, to drink and do drugs. Student life initiatives like the condom rating contest, where prophylactics were scored in categories such as taste and sense of security, or the refusal of the Stanford administration to cover over the glory holes cut into bathroom stalls in the library and cafeteria. We put so much work into rehashing these insanities that the project came to resemble shooting fish in a barrel. One of my smarter liberal friends said, maybe it's all true, but isn't it kind of pornographic, Peter? You just give us a bunch of pornography here, and it doesn't really change anything. And there's something to that. Part of the challenge was to explain why anybody who didn't go to Stanford would want to read this book. The somewhat canned answer was, well, ideas have consequences, and these ideas are going to spread from the university to the rest of society. If you don't pay attention here, the genie is going to get out of the bottle. This was dismissed as a very, very contrived argument back in 1995, though it doesn't seem that way now. When I, Peter Thiel writes, look back on the diversity myth almost 3 decades later, I still think that almost every point we made was right. There's very little that's wrong, which is both gratifying and depressing. Simply being right about particular issues, and all of you here have been fighting these battles for decades know this, hasn't made a dent in the broader diversity agenda. Back then, multiculturalism was the catch-all term for this baggy, monstrous ideology. Today, it calls itself woke and fights for diversity, equity, and inclusion. The problem has only metastasized. We did not make a difference. Is there something that we missed altogether in this debate? What is really going on? To frame this question, I'll refer back to something I think has held up fairly well from the diversity myth, the title. It's an ambiguous title. You can put the stress on one of two words. If you stress diversity, it means that diversity is not real, a fiction. There's no multiculturalism, it's monocultural. The agenda is not non-Western, it's anti-Western. At Stanford, for instance, multicultural initiatives were funded by slashing the budgets of the university's foreign language departments. You don't have diversity when you gather people who look different but talk and think alike. It's not enough to hire the extras from the space cantina scene in Star Wars. Don't know what he's referring to there. Haven't seen it, maybe you know. But there was always a secondary meaning to the title in which you could put the stress on the word myth. Rather than dismiss diversity out of hand, let's just accept that we have no idea what it means. It's like a shibboleth, some kind of idol or false god that our society worships. It's extraordinarily hard to pin down, in fact. The standard administrators tasked with defining multiculturalism in the 1990s did so in the vaguest terms imaginable, as if protecting cult mysteries. What is clear is that we are encamped at the altar of diversity, venerating and honoring it as the highest thing. So the question we should ask is this: in worshiping diversity and making it the highest value, what is it that we are missing? Is this an exercise in attention redirection? A kind of magic show in which you're watching the magician and don't notice the gorilla jumping up and down in back of the stage? There's a latent premise in this kind of questioning. When you observe, as we did, that what's going on is both very evil and very silly, it sounds almost self-contradictory. How can something be both very silly and very evil at the same time? The answer is that what's going on is very silly, but the silliness is distracting us from very important things. That's the nature of the evil. Diversity becomes a kind of divertisement, distracting our attention from the things that really matter. What I'd like to do is delineate a few areas in which diversity is making us ignore the real issues that we should be paying attention to. I want to suggest that, at least on a public policy level, all these debates about diversity, identity politics, multiculturalism, the woke religion, etc., should be treated like debates about homelessness. Homelessness is a mess, it's a problem. And at the same time that it is a very real problem, it's a giant machine to redirect attention from all the other problems across America toward a narrow aspect of big city dysfunction. When homelessness is forced into every policy conversation, it leads to circuitous, dead-end reasoning. We're never going to fix homelessness until we fix the schools, but we're never going to fix the schools, the police, or even the roads until we fix homelessness. It becomes an all-purpose excuse for ignoring what's really going on, so let me, in quick succession, list a few of the deeper issues obscured by our diversity obsession today. Okay, so Peter Thiel is about to argue. Here are the things that diversity is distracting us from. It's a pseudo-problem. It's redirecting our attention. It's a kind of hypnosis that's blinding us to the reality. So let's see how he develops that. Sorry, stretch out a little bit on this. Where are we? 42nd minute of the stream. Give me a minute to take my coffee break. That's nice. And let's continue. Start with the university. It's easy to focus on all the insanity in the humanities. But if you remember what universities themselves believe, that all their serious work, their cutting-edge research is done in the sciences, the focus on the humanities begins to resemble an attention redirect, stifling the hard questions about what's actually going on in the sciences. Are they progressing as advertised? Are we still living in an accelerating world in which science is fundamentally healthy and critical, with diversity of thought? It shouldn't have required COVID to be able to ask these questions, to notice that science, quote unquote, has somehow gotten to be a very, very diseased thing. Most imagine a scientist to be an independent researcher who thinks for himself, and this figure may still appear in children's books. But in practice, the occupation mostly entails the enforcement of a fixed set of dogmas. A few years after the diversity myth came out, a Stanford physics professor, Bob Laughlin, got a Nobel Prize, and he began to suffer from the supreme delusion that now that he had a Nobel Prize in physics, he also had academic freedom and could investigate anything he wanted. Now, there are a lot of controversial topics in science. You could have a heterodox view on stem cell research, or you could be a skeptic of climate change or Darwinism. But Laughlin hit on a topic that was far more taboo than any of the above. He had the idea that most of the scientists were doing no work at all. They were actually stealing money from the government, just creating all these fraudulent grant applications. Laughlin had done a lot of work studying the physics of super high temperatures, superconductivity and the like. And he once told me, Peter Thiel writes, that of the roughly 50,000 papers written on the subject, maybe 25 of them were any good at all. I want to pause for a minute because that reminds me of something that you may find interesting over here at aldaily.com, which is artsandlettersdaily.com. Here's what I want to show you. We're not going to read it. I haven't read it, but on this topic, I want to show you. So Arts and Letters Daily, aldaily.com, has this articles of note, new books, essays, and opinions. And I saw this right here the other day. Our most published research findings false. A wave of shoddy statistical practices has overwhelmed fields, including psychology, economics, and medicine. So here's an article from very recently about how, about this point that Peter Thiel is making, or that Laughlin was making. So now let me get back here. Okay. Laughlin's team started with the biology department at Stanford, launching a sort of inquiry into what exactly it was doing. They didn't actually publish the results. They just had a public hearing and generally denounced all the professors as having stolen money from the government. The generous conclusion would be that the department wasn't fully fraudulent, just an incredibly incrementalist exercise in groupthink that wasn't really moving the dial forward. This was a line of thinking that was completely taboo. I don't need to tell you how the story ends. The question of scientific and technological, in other words, he was punished for publicly calling into question the veracity of the research of his department. This question of science and technological stagnation is in some sense the Achilles heel of the universities. It's hard to uncover. Right now, the humanities are transparently ridiculous. You might think of the humanities as the department of motor vehicles, and the physics department is sort of like the self-proclaimed rocket scientists at the National Security Agency. The CRIPSIS makes their activities look more intelligent and more advanced. But my belief, Thiel writes, is that the DMV is probably better run than NASA. Okay, so the fact that you don't have a clue what's going on at NASA gives you a hint as to which of the two is worse. Something like this is going on with the sciences more broadly. So the humanities are transparently ridiculous, but we don't know what's going on in the sciences, and probably they're even worse. There are two basic debate techniques you can have when you're arguing with someone. You can go after the enemy at the weakest point, which in the college context is the humanities. It's ridiculous, and you're most likely to come away with a sort of tactical victory. But the other strategy is to go after the enemy's strongest point, to say there's no real science going on, that string theorists aren't making the fundamental breakthroughs that we're told, and that physicists have otherwise been twiddling their thumbs for 50 years. And if you can win that point, it's game, set, and match. My second candidate theory, and this is where I have some sympathies with Marxist and Randian types, Thiel writes, amounts to an economically reductionist line of questioning. It's the classic cui bono, who's actually benefiting from this stuff. How does it all play out? An old school Marxist critique of what we call cultural Marxism would say that all these identity politics, the whole diversity agenda, has only served to divide the working class. People are supposed to focus on their real economic interests, and they've been diverted into all these other questions. So from a classically Marxist point of view, DEI initiatives are a fundamentally reactionary form of politics. A historian might point out that since the diversity agenda took off in the 1970s, it has coincided with a massive increase in inequality in this country. Correlation, of course, doesn't prove causation, but were they somehow linked? And if we drill a little deeper, we might conclude that inequality in the United States has largely been driven by real estate interests and corrupt land use agreements. In short, mismanaged cities of one sort or another. If urban slumlords have benefited from citywide diversity initiatives to the tune of trillions of dollars, shouldn't the Marxists be asking questions about how it all worked out? A thought experiment might flesh this crazy theory out just a little bit more. If you were sitting here in Manhattan back in 2007 or in San Francisco, and you told me, Thiel writes, the average rent would double in the next 16 years, I would say that's completely impossible. People would just move. They'd figure out some other place to go. But maybe you countered, well, let's say rent is going to double anyway, and then ask, how would that be possible? It would be inexplicable without recourse to a kind of ideological superstructure, inflicting some version of Stockholm Syndrome. If you're a gay person, you might be told that if you ever move from Manhattan to Hoboken, you'll be beaten up by bat-wielding thugs right away. If you're a woman living in a rat-infested apartment in San Francisco, where the rent is going up and up while you fantasize about a nice suburban house in Reno, Nevada, you might hear that, well, if you ever dare to move to Reno, you're going to be chained to your bed and forced to carry a baby to term. The only logical explanation is that a crazed ideological intensification has distracted us from what's really going on. Of course, real estate interests can't be the sole driver of this phenomenon. Think of all the woke corporations embedded in New York's economy. Was their capitulation to DEI a form of insanity? Or was the woke tax the relatively lesser cost for them to pay? Focusing on the economic consequences of the diversity agenda, the real estate analysis is only the tip of the iceberg. It may be reductionist, but it is revealing. In the university context, such an inquiry might explain why student debt has gone up from $300 billion in 2000 to $2 trillion today. The cop-out answer is that the $2 trillion of student debt went to pay for the $2 trillion worth of lies about how great education is. In my view, Thiel states, this reading is too generous. How much of that $2 trillion actually went to education as opposed to room and board? If you analyze the universities in economic terms, you might even conclude that the dorms and residences are the profit center driving an elaborate real estate racket. And this is not to mention the web of offices and administrators tasked with overseeing not education, but quote-unquote student life. Scale this model up and you begin to understand why it's so hard to exist outside of a big city in the United States, a vast country with swaths of empty space and lots of affordable housing, and why those deplorables who leave the reservation are viewed with such disdain. So let me just pause here and review for a minute. We're reading Peter Thiel's The Diversity Myth. He's asking the question, what is diversity distracting us from? And he's told us two things so far: science and economics. It's distracting us from the failures of science because instead we see the absurdity of the humanities while the incapacity of the scientists takes place behind closed doors. And it's distracting us from economics. It's distracting us from the economic arguments, for example, that he just reviewed about student debt and that he just reviewed about, the rising rate of rents. Now, he goes further. Beyond science and economics lies the question of wokeness as a religion. On one level, it is a distraction from religion. God is the biggest thing there is, it might be observed, and thinking about diversity makes us forget about God. This is true as far as it goes, but on a deeper level, the multicultural agenda is very entangled with the Judeo-Christian tradition. That tradition is strongly identified with the side of the victim. Much of the Bible presents moral reversals in this vein, in a sort of anti-mythological move. The Cain and Abel story, in which the murderous Cain is duly punished for the sin against his brother, is the flip side of the story of Romulus and Remus, in which the slayer Romulus is celebrated from the point of view of the city he goes on to establish. The Jews are the marginalized people in the desert. Christ, of course, is the ultimate victim. The so-called woke religion is a perversion of this Judeo-Christian tradition, but nonetheless closely adjacent to it. So when we describe it as a religion tout court, we're doing it somewhat of a disservice. We need to be far more specific about the ways in which it emulates or differs from Christianity. The two are not identical, but they are so closely related that we might call wokeness a particularly Christian temptation. In responding to the religious woke impulse, there's a kind of Nietzschean anti-diversity move that Thiel says, find incredibly tempting in an emotional sense. It boils down to a strongman argument. Think of Bronze Age pervert and other internet types that says, well, the West may in fact be chauvinist, racist, sexist, and all the other things it's accused of being, but we should embrace that rather than apologize for it. It's a very Nietzschean argument, as I said, but there's also a very Nietzschean counter-argument, perhaps more biographical than philosophical. At the end of his life, when Nietzsche was going insane, he said something along the lines of, God of the Jews, you have won. By this remark, he meant that the modern West would be ruled by the victim. In one sense, Nietzsche's intuition was correct. When modern man stares into the abyss, it's the abyss of the unforgettable victim, now barely clinging to its Judeo-Christian heritage. But was the development Nietzsche foresaw inevitable? Or did it depend on the tacit acceptance on some level of certain distortions to the Judeo-Christian tradition, which Nietzsche and his successors fundamentally misunderstood? That such considerations have largely been confined to remote corners of the internet gives you some sense of how our fixation on diversity has distracted us from a more pressing theological crisis. Here I want to pause for a minute, not in order to comment on what Thiel has just written about Nietzsche and about the Judeo-Christian tradition and its relationship to wokeness, but rather this point, that such considerations have been largely confined to remote corners of the internet gives you some sense of how our fixation on diversity has distracted us from a more pressing theological crisis. I'm surprised because I didn't plan to have this commonality at the outset. What Thiel writes here, and what this article on Dugin's influence in the West writes here, let me just show you. Unexpected resurgence of esoteric rightist ideas from the early 20th century, marginal, fringe, and yet deeply relevant. And here too, ideas that are being studied in remote corners of the internet, but that are absolutely of central importance, even if they're only studied remotely. They are not marginal, they're central, even if they happen to be studied on the margins. So very important, I would say, argument there in favor of studying the German conservative revolutionary thinkers, the very online right, which is debating and discussing Junger and Nietzsche, Strauss, Heidegger, Dugin, and all of those other figures. Some of them I teach in my school, millermanschool.com, but that's not the point. The point is, why are things that are of so central significance, like the pressing theological crisis, confined to remote corners of the internet? Kind of makes you wonder. Well, in part, he's saying that it has to do with the deliberate distraction of the diversity myth. So let's continue. That such considerations have been largely confined to remote corners of the internet gives you some sense of how our fixation on diversity has distracted us from a more pressing theological crisis. However we arrived at this point, the categories we started with are now all quite backwards. The progressive theologically liberal types, backed by institutional support and intent on dispensing their vision of social justice, have come to resemble the nasty money changers in the temple. And then the most regressive fundamentalists, stubbornly persisting in the belief that, well, yeah, everybody's sort of guilty and everybody did some bad things in the past, but we have to forgive one another because otherwise we're never going to move on, are spat upon like Samaritans. But for those of you who think that science, economics, or even religion are distractions from politics, and that these big picture questions are not necessarily the best things to focus on while we man the ramparts, let's ask then, how do ideas like diversity, multiculturalism, and political correctness distract from healthy political discourse? The idea I always come back to, one that strikes me as very suggestive, is the etymology of the term political correctness itself. So just to quickly review, he's told us economics, science, religion. That's what diversity is distracting us from. And now politics. By the 1980s, political correctness was something conservatives used as an epithet to describe deranged ditto heads on the left. If you go back to I haven't heard that before, ditto heads. Kind of made me laugh. If you go back to the 1970s, it was actually used by very progressive people as a term of self-congratulation. But if you go back to the 1950s and strip away all the connotations that accrued over time, if you were a politically correct person in 1950, it meant that you followed directions from Moscow as a card-carrying member of the Communist Party. The totalitarian impulse, with its extraordinary demands on the individual conscience, is baked into the very notion of political correctness. We should think about that. Striving for diversity, especially diversity of thought, can be good. But anyone who prizes liberty, conservatives, libertarians, classical liberals, and the rest, must never lose sight of the cosmic battle against atheist communism. My goal here has been to concretize all these concerns, Thiel writes, not with the aim of providing answers, but simply of asking questions. I'm not saying that my Henry George-inflected real estate analysis is the absolute truth, but we do need to ask how much of college quote-unquote tuition is diverted to real estate interests. Or take TikTok. Surveillance questions aside, we should ask how communist China might benefit from an AI engine that deranges and polarizes our society. And if we're focused on diversity questions, are we supposed to be overly sensitive to various people of East Asian descent? Are we being too sensitive or not sensitive enough? These questions, divert our attention from the far more important communism question, which belongs front and center. So in conclusion, and this is a simplification, perhaps a distortion, but I think you know what I mean, it would be healthier that whenever someone mentions DEI, you just think CCP. Okay, diversity is communism, a distraction from the underlying communism. So when they say DEI, you think CCP and deal with the real problem, the communism problem. Okay, well, I hope that you enjoyed that. I thought that was an article worth reading together. I did send it out to my mailing list yesterday, but I also wanted to cover it with you here. Peter Thiel, The Diversity Myth, June 2023 in The New Criterion. So support those publications, The New Criterion, unheard.com, this nice article that we read earlier on how Aleksandr Dugin influences the West. I think we'll leave it at that for today. I do appreciate you being here. I saw your comments. Thank you. I'm glad that you enjoyed this. I would ask you, like, share, subscribe to the channel if you want to see more such content. Visit millermanschool.com if you'd like to take a look at some of my courses. And at duginbook.com, you'll see my 2 books, one on Heidegger, one on Dugin. Until we meet again, take care, be well, goodbye.